One idea that permeates throughout the entire novel of 1984 by George Orwell is that governments don't allow their citizens to know the full extent of their operations in order to keep them passive and under control. This is a particularly relevant issue today because there have been numerous government cover-ups that have come to light in recent years. In both 1984 and our current society, there are many issues that are present but people choose not to acknowledge. In Western media, things are not entirely hidden so much as not fully disclosed. We think we know what is going on because parts of it are mentioned, so we are satisfied with what little information is provided in the media, but there is usually much more going on than meets the eye. Partial disclosure in our society has almost the same outcome as the total censorship in 1984 in this respect. For many years, U.S. citizens have felt assured of their right to privacy. The U.S. government has been able to keep its people calm by masking the truth about how much it monitors them, just as Big Brother in 1984 manipulates and observes everything that his people do. Recently, government surveillance has been brought to the general public's attention in large part because of a massive NSA leak. In the case of this NSA leak, the U.S. sense of privacy was violently shattered when Edward Snowden, a former NSA employee, revealed that the government was accessing and collecting data from huge internet corporations like Google, Facebook, and even phone conversations from Verizon. This created a massive uproar as many people felt as though they had been personally violated by the government, but they only knew this because of the security breach. Had this breach not occurred, the government would have been able to maintain a veil of secrecy and keep the population under control. Unlike our system, the government in 1984 managed to keep this process seamless. Edward Snowden was persecuted by the United States, but was eventually granted asylum by America's longtime rival, Russia, worsening the public's opinion of the government. North Korea is known as one of the most secretive and oppressive states in the history of the world. Not only are citizens not allowed to contact the outside world, but foreigners are despised because they may spread anti-government ideas. This connects to the people of 1984's hatred towards foreigner Emmanuel Goldstein, all of which is based around propaganda, as the government fears that he will spread different ideas to their people. Intellectuals and Western reporters are often defamed in North Korea and are shown as liars and frauds whom outside governments have sent in to weaken the North Korean system. In 2009, Laura Ling and Yuna Lee, both American reporters, were arrested for illegally crossing the North Korean border and sentenced to 12 years jail time. Similarly, in the novel 1984, intellectuals or revolutionaries such as Winston and Sim are arrested and disappear. The only media that North Koreans can access is decided by the government, and is usually propaganda swayed in favor of leaders, often with parts of history rewritten. In 1984, the only people with knowledge of the true history of Oceania are the proles, who have no education or influence, therefore are not seen as a threat to the government. In the novel 1984, an individual could be sent to a joy camp for committing a minor offense or a larger one, such as thought crime. Joy camps were used to enforce harsh rules onto citizens through forced labor. Many countries today use forced labor camps to instill fear in the civilian population in order to keep them under control. Places such as North Korea, Turkey, China, Cuba, and Bulgaria all use forced labor camps at some point in history. Perhaps the most famous example of forced labor camps were concentration camps, which were used while Nazi Germany was in power. They were used to contain and eventually kill much of the Jewish and minority population in Europe. One striking similarity between the two situations is that they are both made to sound pleasant, while sinister events unfold behind closed doors. Prisoners at concentration camps were made to write letters saying how nice it was, and there was even a fake camp called Theresienstadt, used for propaganda. In 1984, the people who returned from joy camps were forced to make them sound nice. In the book 1984, Oceania is perpetually at war with either East Asia or Eurasia for the benefit of their economy. The party says that this war is to go after Emmanuel Goldstein, an enemy of the party, but in reality they need a way to fuel their economy while keeping citizens in the dark, so they make them work poor jobs only to dump all of the products they make into this unnecessary war in order to keep the cycle going. A similar scenario played out when George Bush declared war against Iraq under the pretense of seeking revenge on the terrorists who committed the 9/11 attacks, but in reality going after the extensive oil amounts that could be found in Iraq. These oil fields were originally owned by the Iraqi government but changed owners to mainly American companies, changing where the money went to. Much like the people in the book 1984, U.S. citizens were blind to some of the government's darkest secrets, one of them being Guantanamo Bay. This is where suspected terrorists were detained and tortured under the jurisdiction of the CIA and with President Bush's knowledge, directly breaking the rules of the Geneva Convention. Just as many citizens in George Orwell's 1984 had some idea that bad things happened at the Ministry of Love but either ignored the truth or turned a blind eye to it, U.S. citizens didn't pay much attention to Guantanamo Bay until government reports about it were declassified. However, this was long after many inhumane things had already occurred. The government was able to keep citizens passive by only distributing a small amount of information about the Guantanamo Bay case. Only in the last few months, after repeated demands for the truth by the press, advocacy groups, and the general public, did the government release detailed descriptions of the atrocities committed in Guantanamo Bay. The only difference here is that in the world of 1984, there is no free press or advocacy group to protest their cruel government. In 1972, several robbers were arrested for wiretapping phones and attempting to steal classified documents during the Democratic National Committee held at the Watergate Hotel. These trespassers were connected to President Nixon's re-election campaign. Although he could not be directly connected to these crimes, Richard Nixon concealed them, destroyed evidence, and even attempted to pay the FBI not to conduct further investigations. In the novel 1984, the thought police is completely in league with the government and is totally corrupt, which is exactly what people feared about the FBI after the Watergate scandal. 2 years later, in 1974, information about the cover-up came to light, and although he was never charged, President Nixon resigned rather than face impeachment. This incident was a direct abuse of power to obstruct justice and opened the American public's eyes to the amount of power that politicians have in the media. A similar situation in 1984 is that Big Brother and the party have absolute power over what the citizens see in the media, and the people and even lower-ranking party members are constantly under surveillance. The idea of information mitigation had existed long before 1984 was published and has been used by many governments to control their citizens' minds and actions. The U.S. government used this tactic when they covered up NSA spying, and North Korea has used it for decades to control its people's actions. Although these instances of governments manipulating information and even completely erasing their darkest activities is distressing, a positive message can also be taken away from it. As our society progresses, the blindness we have regarding what higher powers are doing without our knowledge is slowly fading. This is because of increasing globalization and the advent of the internet. Now you have the ability to find answers from more objective sources such as media from other countries, like the BBC, which often put a more critical and realistic spin on the United States than domestic newspapers do. Looking back in time, we can see how this lack of outside information had shaped history. Would things be different today if Germans had known that their government was committing one of the largest genocides in history? Would they still have blindly trusted Hitler? What if they had been able to read in the New York Times about rumored killing factories? Today we have more food for thought, and critical thinking is becoming a birthright. Now everyday people have the ability to question their government's actions without persecution, which is a luxury that the people of Oceania did not have.